Hi, Amy. It's so great to see you in this virtual space. And what a pleasure to get to talk with you about your work area of interest. Will you tell us about it?
Yes, I'm really glad to be here, and I'm really glad to talk about this new project, area of interest, which is part of an ongoing research that I've been doing engaged with PPEH and their own research projects and their own public engagement. And so the project area of interest is a billboard that is up adjacent to the PES refinery site, um, the oldest, largest refinery on the East Coast, which closed after an explosion and has been really very hazardous to the health of residents around it for a very long time leading up to that explosion and its subsequent closure. And now that refinery site is in the process of remediation and being rebuilt. And so the billboard it's really important that it was a project in public. And so the billboard is cited in this way, that it's available to mobile audiences, who are engaged in automobility, and also walking audiences below the billboard. And what's contained in the billboard, which is a sort of small visual essay that's also a kind of snapshot of my engagement with PPH's research, is 4 items. And so I've been in dialogue with PPH and also to people working with PPH, the Reeves from who are activists who are engaged in dialogue also with PPH in an ongoing way, and also fellows of PPH, to talk about what I'm interested in as it overlays what their interests are. And so there are 4 pieces of information. The first is a map of areas of interest, which are groundwater contamination areas that are, you see them a lot in the media. There are a lot of maps. The maps show how the site is partitioned. And this is a piece of information that's already very public, but I felt it was an interesting opportunity to make it visible in a very different context. I think that there's something, interesting and unusual in sort of taking this kind of information, which usually exists in reports, it exists in news, it exists in humanities research, putting into public in this way. So that's the first piece. The second is a quote from Mr. Charles Reeves. It's a really very powerful quote, and it's about what he would like to be the future for some, if not all, the refinery site, rather than the plan. So the refinery site was purchased by Hilco. It's being remediated into a large logistics center. It's the land on the refinery site has a lot of different kinds of contamination. It was already being remediated, and Hilco will continue to remediate it, but it's not going to be fully remediated. So it's going to become a logistics site, and this happens in many sites. For example, in Los Angeles, for example, around the Santa Clarita Light Rail site, where you have a light rail station over a partially remediated landscape. So what Mr. Reeves would like is, rather than it, or at least partially, to be turned into a cemetery. And he just says, basically, put some flowers and trees and shit on it, make it into a cemetery. And I think that that's a very, very powerful demand for an alternative future. And I felt like it was really important to cite that. This is part of the oral history project. And I saw that, and it sat with me for a very, very long time. And I'm hoping that it sits as a fragment with the public, and people who want to can go to the website for the project and they can access this other information. So it's an artwork. It's an artwork that actually, in some ways is connected to a background of research that people can connect. It's not a design work leading, or a front end to a back end of research, and hopefully it can sit in its own way. So that's the second piece. The third piece of visual information is a botanical sample that is in an archive, and it is an eastern cottonwood tree, and that is a plant that is a tree that has phytoremediation capacities. So for me, there's a question not only about alternative demands for the future of the site, what's the just thing to do, for people like the Reeves, who have lived in the shadow of the refinery and dealt with the health impacts, not only in their own families, but in the larger community in a sustained way over generations, and dealt with the kind of structural violence of not being able to access, being lied to about what's being said, I think that that's very powerful. So what else could happen? There could be fight or remediation, and I think my own work is very engaged with these questions of automobility, toxicity, invisibility, access to information, making information public, and also, imagining alternative futures, and what does that mean? Those are just futures. Those are futures also, that re-examine history of capitalism and the way that it's transformed landscape, the way that it's damaged people's bodies, and thinking about other ways that we can live together, and thinking about these other kinds of questions: environmental justice, air quality, groundwater quality, different kinds of social futures and social relationships. The image was taken by Bethany Wiggin and Alex Ambo. And, in some ways, I'm normally the person who does the legwork and the groundwork, and I go to a place, and it's important for me because I'm able to be engaged and, really sort of learn things I might not otherwise be able to. But in this case, I think I really benefited from what ended up being a sort of a tighter engagement than I normally have, just because the kind of pressure that COVID put on and sort of changed the demands for how we would work together. So these 4 pieces of information comprise the billboard, and it's up for maybe another week. And I'm hoping that it has resonance to mobile audiences and walking audiences, and captures this kind of information and makes it public in a different and surprising way. It's aesthetically, my intent was to use a kind of visual language that you don't normally see on billboards. It's dense, it's black and white. In some ways, it's more like part of a publication. I think also too, back to work of people like Chris Marker and his commentaires, and the way that he thought about a kind of snapshot, and the way that he put images together in a kind of contained filmic way. Now, I'm not sure how this will be received because there's more text than you usually find in a billboard, and people are moving by it fairly quickly.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about that. I wish we had time to invite you to tell a little bit about the negotiations with the media company who we rented the billboard from, who offered to send it over to their art department to fix it up so it would look more like a billboard.
Right. And let me just say this, in other projects I've done, there's always this question of negotiation to make things, to put things into the space that they need to be, and I think there's a question of, in the wrong place. And so I think in some ways, it's definitely the right place, but it's in the wrong place. It has the wrong form. And I think, but I also think too, there's work to have that done, but also too, it produces a kind of negotiation. And with Clear Channel, usually it's not the way I would go. I usually would really try to heavily avoid having a kind of external gatekeeper like Clear Channel. And in this case, it resulted in the work having to have a very large text paid for, which marks it as a political ad, which it isn't. But I think, in some ways, it's an interesting outcome that talks about the difficulty about citing these kind of works in the right place where they need to be seen.
I mean, you've worked with, along, beside, underneath highways, a lot in your work. I'm thinking about the project Public Smog, the part of that project where you made, I think it was 30 billboards across the city. They were installed across the city of Douala in Cameroon. And then in Invisible 5, the Interstate 5 was the backbone or armature of that project. What is it about working with highway infrastructure and its signage that you find compelling or enabling or maybe irritating?
Right. Well, I mean, obviously when you talk about it being a backbone, I think the thing is that the freeway, it's a backbone for capitalism. And it's, in California, for example, where Invisible 5 is, the freeway is where all of the infrastructure is bundled. the water transport, the gas transport. So when people are moving along that, they're also moving along that infrastructure, but they're also participating in pollution. They're also inhaling pollution, So there's a kind of complexity to the relationship of automobility, but also too in California, in Invisible 5, which is an audio tour about environmental justice struggle through the state. Obviously, that's a way that people were able to connect and support each other in different organizing struggles. So I think that, the audio, because it's so central to American life, it's so central to sort of our relationship to petrocapitalism, that to me, it's a commanding place to work. And I think it's different, in Douala, Cameroon, where there's a different shape of the politics there, and there's a different shape of the kind of meaning of work in that local context. But I do think there's a question about, how work along the highway is received. And, I really think about sculptural armature. It's true. Like, you have a kind of social sculpture. It's on this armature. The armature is a real-time social system. So, with public smog, with Invisible 5, it was a way to kind of thinking about a kind of public space that happens through automobility. And there's also a kind of time that happens, a kind of audience that happens, and a kind of participation that happens.
I was just thinking, I originally came to the refinery via the Schuylkill River, which the refinery kind of straddles and occupies over 1,300 acres. And you've kind of came to the refinery via the highway, but the highway and the river map much of the same routes. Highways often replicate rivers, and they're rivers of colonial power as well. I'm thinking a lot about the ways that that river, the siting of the highway, the siting of the refinery are also indicative of ongoing colonial relations. We've touched on this in aspects of the process of creating area of interest, but I know as a participant in that process, I found it endlessly fascinating and actually really meaningful to be part of. And I wonder if you might want to illuminate other aspects of the process of its creation that you haven't yet spoken about, or highlight other parts of the
Sure. The process of developing this project involved creating a workshop, and the workshop brought together a bunch of different practitioners and fellows and students in the program into a workshop. And I was very interested before I came to this project, through other projects I've done in the Atmospheric Guide and Public Smog, in the Denora Smog Museum, which marked the 1948 Denora Smog event, and an inversion fog that combined with zinc air pollution, and basically injured a lot of people, killed many people in the Denora area, and led to the development in a very kind of long process of the first clean air laws in the United States. And so the fact is that I became very interested when I heard they had a museum, and it's a small regional museum. So I wanted to work with them and talk to them and find out more about their project. So for the workshop, I invited Brian Charlton, who is the cultural historian and curator there, into conversation. And also PPEH invited the Reeves in terms of the conversation from their position. So for me, this kind of early part of the research ended up leading to this project in a way, I think, and began to structure it in a way that I hadn't necessarily anticipated. And along the way, Bethany and Alex also worked together with me to go to the site to do this kind of surface soil sampling, and which I'm hoping to integrate into a future work. And also my continued conversations with the Reeves, with other fellows and researchers who are connected to the program, also helped inform me in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise been able to begin to kind of produce the background knowledge, but also to be introduced to the kind of depth of material that they had, whether it was oral histories or whether it was access to, the enormous amount of white papers and reports that have been generated in the process of remediation. And all of that, you know, I have all of that material now, and I think the question is, you know, how to articulate that in a way that is succinct for myself as an artist in the way that I thought would be valuable in this moment, especially when it might not be possible to do other kinds of work.
You have such a really, I think, brilliant body of work around the topic or directly engaging with the topic of environmental injustice. And I wondered if you have been able or would care to articulate a kind of like how to work with, as an artist, how best to work with environmental justice communities. Even at a distance, working remotely with the Reeves, your engagement with their stories and their work has been very powerful. You've done it in many other places. I wonder if you want to reflect on kind of how to.
Answer that question. First, it made me think that I wanted to recommend Pablo Helguera's Education for Socially Engaged Art. It's a book that's been around maybe since 2010, 2011. But what I like about it is that it actually it's a book for artists, and basically it talks about them about, you know, kind of a number of different registers in which to engage, and also what you need to take into account when you're doing that kind of engagement. And I think it's a really solid book, and it still holds, and I think it's very helpful and broad groundwork. You know, on top of that, I would say, you know, when I worked with Green Action for Health and Environmental Justice and proposed doing Invisible 5 with them, you know, I really had to come with an understanding of the work they were doing. You know, I really had to do a lot of outreach and also be prepared for people not to want to work with me. You know, I also, some of the things I need to do were, you know, very like, don't compete for funding, right? Things like that, which I think are, you know, really significant. And maybe they're quite structural, but I think one, you know, be informed, you know, do as much of the work you can take on yourself, rather, you know, don't be a burden to your partners, you know, be politically knowledgeable, you know, be informed, and also be willing to accept no. And also too, I think that things have changed since that time. You know, I think that there are a lot more artists who are doing work in this sphere, you know, and depending on their positionality, you know, I think that, you know, some organizations may really have a strong idea of what they want and what they might not want, which is different maybe than 10 years ago. So I think just having that in perspective, and also thinking about taking on multiple partners so that you can really enrich that collaboration is also, I would say, my final recommendation, or my final thought on what's helpful, what works. I guess I would say that one of the powerful things about working, you know, in an interdisciplinary fashion with partners who come from different spheres is that you're able to hold a lot of positions, become better informed. You know, the work is better informed. You know, there's the possibility that dialogue is going to enrich everyone's position, that we're going to be able to speak more robustly and more diversely to more different audiences. You know, more be engaged with more people in broader spheres, which I think, you know, you would hope for the work.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that you drew the connection along the highway armature of 76 from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh and Donora was really powerful for the Reeves also to understand some of the history and structure of their struggle as connected to Donora, people who don't look anything like them, who have a very different history and yet are dealing with very similar issues, who've made a museum, not a cemetery, but finding a way to memorialize what has happened there. That was so powerful for the Reeves to have that connection.
You know, it was powerful to me to hear, but I think the other thing that's powerful, not to be lost, is that in Donora, they're still fighting those battles for cleanup now.
It's a really important point that with slow violence comes slow justice as well. Amy, thank you so much for this conversation.